everything is frequency and vibration.
See, that's exactly the direction I would go.
And do you believe in zero-point energy?
I haven't researched it enough to say I believe in it, but I do think that there are forms of energy that are orders of magnitude more efficient than anything we're using today.
I mean, if you put... I believe they were able to harness some type of energy out of the earth to move those. I don't see any other way.
That's exactly the direction I would go with it.
And I mean, if you put if you just put a block or a paperweight or whatever on a table or on top of a speaker and apply frequency and vibration, it moves on its own. And so if you had some people guiding where that needed to be moved, that seems to be the only... I don't know how the hell you would do it or how you would harness the energy or create frequency and vibration to be able to vibrate the earth to get people. I mean, basically, we're talking about levitation, and I just don't see any other way how to do it. But it seems to be the only logical explanation that.
I think levitation was probably a scientific reality to ancient cultures.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the stories about the Ark of the Covenant, it was sheathed in gold, and it would have been extremely heavy. Would have been very difficult for people to lift and move. And I've seen some calculations of how heavy the damn thing would have been. And, it was carried on staves because no one, according to the accounts, no one could touch it, lest they would get fried somehow. But I noticed, interestingly, that, the tribe that was the only tribe that was allowed of the 12 tribes to actually transport and move the Ark of the Covenant. Do you know which tribe that was?
I do not.
The Levites.
The Levites.
Levites. Levity. Levitation.
Got it. Got it.
And, having looked into some of these mystery religions like Kabbalah and stuff that say that there's hidden meanings to the words in the language, homonyms and synonyms and things that, that's the whole basis of the Kabbalistic system. That caught my eye, and I thought, that's an interesting coincidence.
What were some of the hypothesized steps that our surviving ancestors took to survive a 20 to 30 degrees Celsius environmental temperature change and build back a new society?
Okay, I don't know of temperature change that extreme, although we're looking at some very extreme. I mean, we're looking at 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, which would be about 18 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's way beyond anything we've experienced in recent times.
Yeah.
Coming out of the Little Ice Age 150 to 200 years ago, temperature of the planet has warmed about 1 degree. So we're looking at warming of 20 times that much. And some of the studies based on ice cores, Greenland ice cores, Antarctic ice cores, other kinds of proxy evidence, the time span in which this temperature change occurred has gone from 1,000 years to a century, then from a century to a decade, then from a decade to 5 years, and now the latest, as we get to this ever more refined temporal resolution, like from the studies of ice cores, it's down to 1 to 3 years. So what happened? That's a mystery. Now, what did people do? That's a very interesting question to me. Like, you need to find a place of refuge to ride this thing out. Because at the same time these extreme temperature changes are happening, the whole surface of the planet is being remodeled in a major way. So one of the things that would absolutely be necessary is to find the places of refuge. Now, in ecologists, when they look at the decimation of the whole ecosystem, like a great microcosm of that would be the Mount St. Helens eruption of 1980, when you had about 200 square miles just utterly decimated, turned into a lunar landscape. Well, you've got biologists and ecologists and stuff have been studying how nature has reclaimed that. And what usually happens is you have these pockets where some seeds or whatever spores primarily, because the first colonizer plants that show up in the aftermath of catastrophe are ferns. And so this is what happened. You have these pockets of life recovering, and then from those little islands of life, of biological activity, it spreads out. And at the rate that it's been recovering, it's been, 40 years now since that big eruption. And it's probably, there's now forests encroaching upon the area of devastation. Give it another 50 to 100 years and it should be completely recovered. Now, the question is if we're faced, because to me, two questions. One, the historical question, because we now know that these tremendous catastrophes have happened and have happened repeatedly. So, and then if they happen again, for example, we know that asteroid and cometary impacts are way more frequent than anybody was imagining a generation ago. Excuse me, I'm a little hoarse today. But interestingly, what we've seen in the last 25, 30 years is that geologists looking at the Earth down below have seen multiple scars from these tremendous cosmic events, impacts of asteroids and meteors, comets and cometary debris. There's right now about 200 craters and or astroblems that have been discovered. Now, an astrobleme is an impact scar, but it's usually buried beneath the surface. It's called, literally translates as star wound. Mm-hmm. Star wound. If we were faced with something like, if we can go back to now what's almost certainly a
this
real
is strictly
event.
in mythology.
Okay, so here we got mythology. Mm-hmm. And here we have scientific evidence that Earth was blasted around 12,900 years ago by a multi-impact event.
Okay.
A smaller version of what happened to Jupiter. Okay? Now, modern humans have been around for probably a couple of 100,000 years. So the event that happened is called the Younger Dryas. Younger Dryas was initially it was an extreme climate event that was documented in Europe because it's named after a flower called Dryas octopetala. Dryas octopetala is a polar wildflower that loves the cold. So when these botanists and whoever was studying the plant, they saw that it was growing in Europe during the Ice Age, when Europe was 10 degrees colder than now, and then it disappeared for about 1,300 years, and then it suddenly came back again. So from that, they concluded, well, you've got this cold-loving flower that was there, then it was suddenly gone, and then it reappeared. So you had this interval where it warmed up, and the flower didn't like the warm weather. And then it came back again, so that means the cold weather came back. Now, the Younger Dryas, that was how it was first identified, like 30, 40 years ago, was the study of this polar wildflower. Well, since then, we've learned all kinds of interesting things. One is that the mass extinction of the great megafauna that lived during the Ice Age, there was, over 100 species of megafauna that did not survive the end of the Ice Age, right? I mean, when was the last time you saw a woolly mammoth roaming around the forests of Tennessee?
It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. But 12,000, 13,000 years ago, you had several species of elephants living here in Tennessee.
Interesting.
You don't think about elephants, you think Africa, India, but you don't think North America. An elephant is a proboscidean, meaning it has a long snout, a long nose. Up until the end of the last Ice Age, there were 4 species of proboscideans living in North America. Think about that. Mm-hmm. They're all gone now. What happened to them? Well, there's different theories. One theory, which I think considered to be ridiculous, is that they were hunted to extinction by nomadic tribes of hunters. But given that the estimates for the human population at the end of the last Ice Age, and we're talking 12 to 15,000 years ago roughly, those estimates of total global human population range between 5 and 10 million. Estimates for total number of mammoths, 12 million.
Wow.
12 million mammoths. That's just an estimate, but it's probably in the ballpark. Now, let's say you got 10 million people. How many of those people, now that's women, children, elderly, how many of those are going to actually be hunters? And hunters that are capable of taking down a mammoth.
It's 25% or less.
What?
25% or less.
That's probably about right, yeah. So what does that leave? A couple of million people were able to exterminate every mammoth on Earth in less than 1,000 years?
No way.
No. And then when we look at the circumstances under which we find those mammoths and other extinct animals, that's not, we find them frozen in permafrost. There was a Rogan podcast where he had John Reeves, who's a gold prospector, and he owns a large tract of land in an undisclosed location in Alaska. On his land, there's a valley that's filled with permafrost. When you dig into that permafrost, half of it is the remains of extinct megafauna. Bones, twisted ligaments, pieces of muscle that have been, skin that have been frozen. It looks like they took a whole ecosystem, dumped it in a gigantic blender, blended it all up, and then dumped this shit in the river valleys of this area in Alaska. Now, those kinds of things have been documented for over 200 years. Explorers up there seeing that kind of stuff. Coming out of the Yukon, coming out of Alaska, coming out of Siberia, for years and years and years, they were exporting mammoth tusks, ivory, right? To this day, a lot of old pianos built in the 1800s and stuff have mammoth ivory that are the keys. Thousands and thousands of those tusks were dug out of the permafrost. They didn't end up there from human hunters. They were destroyed in some type of a catastrophe. The most likely trigger for catastrophe, I think, is from out there. And in some of the bone beds up in those areas, they've now discovered iridium, platinum spikes, which are delivered to Earth via cosmic impact. That's how they discovered that, originally came up with the theory that the dinosaurs had been killed in this great impact, was because they discovered a layer that's right there at that KT boundary layer, 66 million years old, below which you had dinosaurs and above which there were no dinosaurs. In the late 1970s, they took a closer look at that layer, and they discovered it was more than 100 times richer in iridium than below or above that layer. They said, where the hell did all this iridium come from? Well, they knew that iridium is delivered to Earth via cosmic impact. So this was a group that was looking at a KT boundary layer in Italy. And they contacted their colleagues, first in Denmark, then in New Zealand, because they were trying to determine, well, how widespread was this? It looks like there was a dusting of iridium. Well, they contacted their colleagues in other places around the world, and they said, go back, take a closer look at that KT boundary layer and see if there's an iridium spike. And in every case, there was an enormous enhancement of iridium, which led them to then believe that the entire planet got dusted with iridium. So how do you do that? Well, again, you blow up an asteroid and you distribute its debris pulverize it so that its debris is microscopic, and you inject that into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere carries it around the planet. From the concentration of iridium, they were able to calculate, and based upon, we know that two things. When we pick up meteorites in the field, they can measure the amount of iridium or other group, platinum, ruthenium, zirconium, other platinum group metals. They can actually measure directly in the meteorites. Then you can look at the spectral emissions of asteroids, and those substances will have very distinct spectral signatures. And so they were able to estimate, okay, we've got X amount of iridium. Given the percentages of iridium that we know is in an asteroid, how big of an asteroid would it have to be? And they came up with they did the math on it. So it's going to have to be about 6 miles in diameter. Then they said, okay, if you've got a 6-mile diameter asteroid with a closing velocity of 20 miles per second, what size crater is that going to create? 150 miles roughly in diameter.
Holy
so they
shit.
speculated, said, somewhere there must be a 150-mile crater if we're right. All the skeptics were saying, well, until you can show us the crater, we're not buying into this, that they're, because that's too drastically different than our old models of gradual extinction, right? Well, at the same time, Petroleum Mexico is drilling, in the northern Yucatan Peninsula. And they had drilled down about through a 0.5 kilometer of limestone sediment, and at the bottom of that drill core, they hit something hard. They brought up samples of it. It was this green, vitrified, really dense glass-like material. Their first assumption was volcanic. Well, word of this eventually got to some American scientists that were trying to figure out what happened at the KT boundary. They went down there, they got more samples, and they started doing subsurface surveys, and they could see that there was a giant circular structure buried under a 0.5 mile of limestone. And this green vitrified stuff was the rock that had melted in the superheated temperatures that were created by this impact. They've gone on. I mean, they, for example, have found the remnants of gigantic tsunamis in Louisiana and Texas that were washed north. So it was a long process, but this occurred in like the early 90s. So in 1980, 3 teams separately proposed that the extinction of the dinosaurs at the KT boundary was triggered by an impact. The team of Walter and Louis Alvarez, who studied the outcrop in Italy, theirs seemed to be the most accurate in terms of what we now know happened then. But it took a decade for them to be vindicated, and it was with the discovery of that huge crater and the dating of that crater that, again, right there, 66 million years ago, right? Now, of course, that was long before humans. Now, fast forward to the Younger Dryas, the lower Younger Dryas boundary, which is dated just a little bit younger than 12,900 years. Iridium has been found. Platinum has been found at that. Nanodiamonds have been found, which are microscopic diamonds. And the only other place that diamonds just like that have been found, the KT boundary from 66 million years ago.
Wow.
So it's almost certain that but we still have large factions of the scientific community that doesn't want to go there, doesn't want to admit that there could have been a global catastrophe 12 or 13,000 years ago. And, part of the political narrative now is that humans are causing the 6th great mass extinction, and Exhibit A is the fact, oh, look what humans did to the woolly mammoths. They exterminated them all. So there proves that humans can cause mass extinctions. They don't want that to be taken away from them, so they're refusing. That's part of it. But there's a whole group of them that just, as the evidence continues to accumulate, they just do not want to go there. At some point, it'd be really you should get George Howard.
George Howard.
George Howard. He has a website called the Cosmic Tusk, and he's been in the forefront of this research probably since the 80s.
Interesting.
Right? He's also was one of the co-authors of a paper that came out in 2007 that proposed that the mass extinction was caused by some type of an impact. That was 2007. And that ignited a firestorm of controversy. It's gone back and forth and back and forth. But at this point, I think 8 to 10 teams around the world have independently verified that there is the fingerprints of a cosmic impact event that occurred around 12,000 800 to 12,900 years ago that seems to be right there along with the mass extinction.
Yep.